The tow truck's diesel engine growled like a predator in the early morning silence of Willowbrook Estates. Margaret Henderson stood on her perfectly manicured lawn, her HOA badge gleaming in the dawn light like a sheriff's star, watching with cold satisfaction as the bright red Chevrolet Silverado was hoisted onto the flatbed. "Finally," she whispered to herself, her thin lips curling into a triumphant smile. "These people need to learn their place." The truck belonged to Marcus Williams, a 28-year-old construction foreman who'd been living in the exclusive gated community for exactly 3 months. 3 months of Margaret's carefully orchestrated campaign to make his life miserable. 3 months of violations notices, threatening letters, and whispered complaints to other residents about their kind lowering property values. But Marcus had no idea his truck was being stolen in broad daylight. He was inside his modest 2-story home, exhausted from a 16-hour shift rebuilding a collapsed bridge downtown. The same bridge that would save lives. The same bridge that made him a hero in the eyes of the mayor, but a target in the eyes of his HOA president. Margaret pulled out her phone, her fingers dancing across the screen as she typed another violation notice. Unauthorized commercial vehicle parked overnight in residential area. Fine, $500. Vehicle towed at owner's expense. She hit send with the satisfaction of a judge delivering a death sentence. What she didn't know was that across town, in the grand chambers of the Superior Court, Judge Robert Williams was reviewing case files for the morning session. The same steel-gray eyes, the same strong jawline, the same unshakable sense of justice that had made him the youngest African-American judge in the state's history. Marcus Williams wasn't just another resident. He was Judge Williams' son. But Margaret Henderson had done her research, or so she thought. She'd seen Marcus arrive in his work clothes, his hands dirty from honest labor. She'd watched him park his truck, a tool of his trade, not a symbol of his status. In her twisted worldview, he was exactly what she'd spent 20 years trying to keep out of Willowbrook Estates. The irony was suffocating. Margaret lived in a $400,000 townhouse, financed to the breaking point to maintain her image. Marcus owned his $650,000 home outright, purchased with savings from his construction company and a generous gift from his father. But appearances were everything to Margaret, and appearances had led her down a path she'd never returned from. The tow truck driver, a weathered man named Eddie, felt sick to his stomach as he secured the straps. "Ma'am, you sure about this? That's a nice truck. Probably cost more than my house." Margaret's voice cut through the morning air like broken glass. "I don't care if it's made of gold. Rules are rules. These people think they can just move into our neighborhood and do whatever they want." Eddie's stomach churned. He'd seen this before. The barely concealed hatred, the coded language, the way Margaret's eyes burned with something darker than mere HOA enforcement. But he needed the money. His own family depended on his towing contract with the Homeowners Association. As the truck disappeared around the corner, Margaret felt a rush of power coursing through her veins. This was her kingdom, her domain to protect. She'd been HOA president for 8 years, and in those 8 years, she'd successfully encouraged 12 families to leave. 12 families who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection, but as she walked back to her house, adjusting the American flag magnet on her mailbox, Margaret had no idea that her perfectly ordered world was about to shatter like glass. Inside his home, Marcus stirred awake to the sound of his phone buzzing. A text from his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly Korean War veteran's widow who'd become like a grandmother to him. "Marcus, honey, they took your truck. That awful Henderson woman called a tow truck. I got pictures." Marcus sat up in bed, his heart pounding. He looked out his window at the empty driveway where his pride and joy had been parked, the truck his father had helped him choose when he'd started his construction company 5 years ago. the truck that bore the scars of honest work and the dreams of a young man who'd overcome every obstacle society had thrown his way. But as Marcus reached for his phone to call the police, he had no idea that his father, the Honorable Judge Robert Williams, was about to make a decision that would change everything. The morning court session was about to begin, and Margaret Henderson's name was on the docket for an entirely different matter. A matter that would expose her for exactly what she was. Marcus Williams stood in his empty driveway, his bare feet cold against the concrete, staring at the oil stain where his truck had been. The violation notice crumpled in his fist like his faith in the American dream. 3 months in Willowbrook Estates, and he'd endured more harassment than he'd faced in his entire life. It had started the day he moved in. Margaret Henderson had appeared at his door within hours of the moving truck's departure, clipboard in hand, thin lips pursed in barely concealed disgust. "I'm the HOA president," she'd announced, as if the title carried the weight of royalty. "We need to discuss some concerns." The concerns were always petty, always targeted, always assigned to make him feel unwelcome. His truck was too commercial for the neighborhood. His work boots left unsightly marks on his driveway. His music was too loud, even when played at whisper volumes. The American flag he'd hung by his front door was improperly displayed, despite being identical to the ones fluttering throughout the neighborhood. But Marcus had endured it all with quiet dignity, the way his father had taught him. "Son," Judge Williams had often said during Marcus's turbulent teenage years, "true strength isn't in your fists, it's in your character. Let your work speak louder than their hatred." And Marcus's work did speak. Williams Construction had rebuilt 3 schools, 2 community centers, and countless homes for families who'd lost everything to natural disasters. He employed 15 people, paid above-market wages, and donated 10% of his profits to scholarship funds for underprivileged children. But none of that mattered to Margaret Henderson. She saw only what she wanted to see, a young black man who threatened her carefully constructed world of suburban supremacy. Mrs. Chen hobbled over from her adjacent yard, her walker clicking against the sidewalk. At 82, she'd survived the Korean War, racism in 1950s America, and the loss of 3 husbands. Margaret Henderson was just another bully in a long line of people who'd underestimated her. "That woman is evil," Mrs. Chen said, her voice shaking with righteous anger. "Pure evil! I've been living here for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone treated like this." Marcus helped her to his front steps, both of them sitting in the morning sun that felt too bright for such a dark day. "It's okay, Mrs. Chen. I'll figure it out." "No, it's not okay." Her weathered hand gripped his arm with surprising strength. "My Harold didn't die in Korea so people like her could terrorize good families. You're the best neighbor I've ever had. You fix my fence, shovel my walkway, check on me when I'm sick. That woman, she called code enforcement on me when my grass was 2 inches too high after my hip surgery." The pattern was becoming clear. Margaret Henderson wasn't just racist. She was a predator who targeted anyone she perceived as vulnerable. The elderly, the working class, anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of acceptable. But she'd made a catastrophic error in targeting Marcus Williams. As Marcus called the towing company, his phone buzzed with another text, this time from his father. "Running late to court. Busy morning ahead. Love you, son." Judge Robert Williams had no idea his son was under attack. He was preparing for what he assumed would be a routine morning session. A few minor infractions, some property disputes, maybe a divorce proceeding. His calendar showed only one case of interest. Henderson versus Willowbrook Estates, HOA Board. Margaret Henderson was suing her own HOA board for trying to remove her as president. The irony was nuclear. Margaret had spent months terrorizing Marcus while simultaneously fighting to maintain her position of power. the same power she'd abused to make his life hell. At the towing company, Marcus faced another humiliation. The clerk, a young woman with bored eyes and gum-snapping attitude, barely looked up from her magazine. "Henderson called it in herself," she said, examining her nail polish. "Said it was a commercial vehicle in violation of neighborhood covenants. You'll need to pay the fine, towing fee, and storage costs. That'll be $847. $847. Nearly a month's wages for some people. A devastating blow designed to punish and deter. Marcus had the money. His construction company was thriving, but the principle burned like acid in his chest. "I'd like to see the complaint documentation," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The clerk finally looked up, irritation flashing across her features. "Look, buddy, I don't make the rules. Lady says you're in violation. Truck gets towed. You want it back, you pay the fee." But Marcus wasn't just anybody. He was the son of a judge, raised in a household where due process and constitutional rights weren't just legal concepts, but sacred principles. "I'm not paying anything until I see the legal justification for this seizure of my property." The word seizure sent a chill through the office. The manager emerged from the back room, suddenly interested in a conversation he'd been ignoring. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret Henderson was preparing for her own legal battle. She'd hired the most expensive attorney she could barely afford, convinced that her 8 years as HOA president had given her unassailable authority. She had no idea that her opponent, the HOA board trying to remove her, had documented every complaint, every harassment incident, every abuse of power. They had photos of Marcus's truck being towed. They had recordings of Margaret's phone calls referring to "those people" and maintaining property values. They had testimony from Mrs. Chen, from other targeted residents, from delivery drivers who'd been screamed at for loitering while dropping off packages. Margaret Henderson's reign of terror was about to face the one thing she'd never encountered in her life: consequences. But the morning held one more twist that would change everything. As Marcus finally retrieved his truck, after threatening the towing company with a federal civil rights lawsuit, he received a call from his father's chambers. "Marcus, it's Judge Williams' clerk. Your father asked me to call. He's had a family emergency come up and needs to postpone his lunch plans with you today. Something about a case that's requiring his immediate attention." The case requiring Judge Williams's immediate attention was Henderson versus Willowbrook Estates HOA Board. Father and son were about to collide in the most unexpected way possible. And Margaret Henderson, sitting in the courthouse parking lot, applying lipstick in her rearview mirror and rehearsing her victim narrative, had no idea she was about to face the father of the man she'd spent months trying to destroy. The scales of justice were about to balance in the most poetic way imaginable. Judge Robert Williams entered courtroom 3A with the measured stride of a man who'd spent 25 years dispensing justice. At 58, his graying temples and steel-gray eyes commanded immediate respect. He'd presided over murder trials, corporate fraud cases, and constitutional challenges. But this Tuesday morning felt different somehow, charged with an electricity he couldn't explain. "All rise," the bailiff announced. "The Honorable Judge Robert Williams presiding." Margaret Henderson stood at the plaintiff's table, her cheap business suit struggling to project the authority she desperately craved. Her attorney, David Brennan, had already warned her that their case was weak. The HOA board had documentation of her misconduct stretching back years. But Margaret was convinced her 8-year tenure as president gave her untouchable status. She had no idea she was standing before the father of her latest victim. Judge Williams settled into his chair, reviewing the case file one final time. Henderson vs. Willowbrook Estates HOA Board, a property dispute involving accusations of harassment and abuse of power. The plaintiff was seeking an injunction to maintain her position as HOA president, while claiming the board was retaliating against her for maintaining community standards. "Ms. Henderson," Judge Williams began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You're seeking to enjoin the HOA board from proceeding with your removal as president. Please state your case." Margaret's voice trembled with practiced victimhood. "Your Honor, I've dedicated 8 years of my life to protecting property values in Willowbrook Estates. The board is trying to remove me because I've had to make difficult decisions to maintain our community standards. They're retaliating against me for doing my job." Judge Williams nodded professionally, but something in Margaret's tone, the way she emphasized community standards, sent a chill down his spine. He'd heard that coded language before, in civil rights cases from decades past. The HOA board's attorney, Sarah Martinez, stood to present their evidence. "Your Honor, Ms. Henderson has engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment targeting specific residents. We have documented proof of discriminatory enforcement, verbal abuse, and actions that violate both our community bylaws and federal fair housing laws." As Martinez began presenting evidence, Judge Williams felt his blood pressure rising. Photos of violation notices sent exclusively to minority residents. Recordings of Margaret's phone calls using racial slurs. Testimony from elderly residents who'd been harassed for minor infractions while identical violations by white residents were ignored. But then Martinez displayed a photo that stopped Judge Williams' heart. It was Marcus's truck being towed at dawn, with Margaret Henderson standing proudly in the background, her arms crossed in triumph. "This morning," Martinez continued, "Ms. Henderson orchestrated the illegal towing of a resident's vehicle. The truck belonged to Marcus Williams, a construction company owner who purchased his home in cash and has never violated any legitimate community guidelines. Ms. Henderson targeted Mr. Williams because—" Judge Williams's gavel cracked against the bench like a gunshot. "Did you say Marcus Williams?" The courtroom fell silent. Margaret Henderson's face went white. She couldn't understand why the judge's demeanor had suddenly changed from professional detachment to barely controlled rage. "Yes, Your Honor," Martinez replied, confused by the interruption. "Marcus Williams of 1247 Maple Drive. He's been systematically harassed by Ms. Henderson since moving to the community 3 months ago." Judge Williams set down his gavel with trembling hands. His son. They were talking about his son. The young man he'd raised to believe in justice, in the American dream, in the promise that hard work and good character would shield him from the hatred that had plagued previous generations. Margaret Henderson had been torturing his child. "Your Honor," Margaret's attorney interjected, sensing something had shifted dramatically. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess." "No." Judge Williams' voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. His 25 years of judicial restraint warred with his primal instinct to protect his son. But justice would be served properly, legally, completely. "Ms. Henderson," Judge Williams said, his voice deadly calm. "Before we proceed, I need to ask you directly. Have you been harassing Marcus Williams?" Margaret sensed a trap, but couldn't identify it. Her narcissism convinced her that she was the victim, that her actions were justified. "Your Honor, Mr. Williams has been flagrantly violating community standards. His truck is commercial equipment that doesn't belong in a residential neighborhood. I was simply enforcing our covenants." "His truck," Judge Williams repeated slowly, "which you had illegally towed this morning." "It wasn't illegal!" Margaret's composure cracked. "I have the authority as HOA president to—" "You have no authority to steal someone's property!" Judge Williams' voice thundered through the courtroom. "You have no authority to harass residents! You have no authority to target people based on your personal prejudices!" The courtroom erupted. Margaret's attorney grabbed her arm, whispering frantically for her to stop talking. The HOA board members exchanged shocked glances. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype machine. But Margaret Henderson, drunk on 8 years of unchecked power, couldn't stop herself. "People like him don't belong in our neighborhood. We worked hard to build a community with standards, with values, and we won't let it be destroyed by... By what, Ms. Henderson? Judge Williams' voice was ice cold now. Please, enlighten this court. What exactly do you think Marcus Williams represents? And in that moment, Margaret H. Henderson sealed her fate. Her mask slipped completely, revealing the hatred she'd spent years hiding behind bureaucratic language and community standards rhetoric. By people who don't share our values, who don't understand how to maintain property, who bring crime and noise and... She stopped, finally realizing the hole she'd dug for herself. Judge Williams leaned forward, his eyes burning with righteous fury. Ms. Henderson, Marcus Williams is my son. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face went from white to gray to green. Her attorney closed his eyes in defeat. The HOA board members stared in shock at the nuclear bomb that had just detonated in their quiet community dispute. Judge Williams continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of justice itself. And you, Ms. Henderson, are about to learn what happens when you target the wrong family. The courtroom existed in a state of suspended animation, as if the very air had crystallized around Judge Williams' revelation. Margaret Henderson swayed at the plaintiff's table, her face the color of ash, her carefully constructed world crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. Your Honor, her attorney stammered, I think we need to discuss a possible conflict of interest. There is no conflict, Judge Williams declared, his voice carrying the authority of Mount Sinai itself. This court has jurisdiction over this matter, and I have every legal right to preside over a case involving discriminatory housing practices. The fact that one of the victims happens to be my son only strengthens my resolve to see justice served properly. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. For 8 years, she'd wielded her HOA presidency like a weapon against anyone who threatened her vision of suburban perfection. She'd driven out families with threats, harassment, and bureaucratic terrorism. But now she faced something she'd never encountered. Consequences delivered by someone with real power. Ms. Henderson, Judge Williams continued, his tone shifting from judicial to personal, let me tell you about the Marcus Williams you've been tormenting. He graduated summa cum laude from State University with a degree in civil engineering. He started his construction company with a $10,000 loan and built it into $1 million operation that employs 15 people and has rebuilt half the infrastructure in this county. Margaret tried to interrupt, but Judge Williams' gaze silenced her like a physical blow. He volunteers at homeless shelters. He mentors at-risk youth. He's rebuilt homes for 3 hurricane victims free of charge. He bought his house in your precious neighborhood with cash because he wanted to live somewhere safe and quiet where he could raise the family he hopes to have someday. The judge's voice grew stronger, more passionate. But you saw a young black man who worked with his hands, and you decided he was your enemy. You decided he didn't deserve the American dream he'd earned through sweat, intelligence, and integrity. Sarah Martinez, the HOA board's attorney, seized the moment. Your Honor, we have evidence that Ms. Henderson's harassment of your son is part of a broader pattern. She's targeted every minority family who's moved to Willowbrook Estates in the past 8 years. Present your evidence, Judge Williams commanded. Margaret collapsed into her chair, the full weight of her actions finally crushing her. 8 years of unchecked power, 8 years of terrorizing innocent families, 8 years of believing she was untouchable, all destroyed in one morning because she'd targeted the wrong person's son. But Judge Williams had one final blow to deliver. Ms. Henderson, there's something else you should know. That commercial truck you had illegally towed, it was returning from a 16-hour emergency repair job on the downtown bridge. The bridge that collapsed last week and would have killed dozens of people if my son hadn't worked through the night to make it safe. Margaret's face went from gray to green. While you were plotting to harass him for parking his truck in his own driveway, Marcus was saving lives. While you were crafting violation notices, he was preventing a catastrophe that would have made national news. The irony was suffocating. Margaret Henderson, who'd spent years claiming to protect her community's values, had spent months tormenting the very man who'd protected her community's lives. "Court is adjourned," Judge Williams declared, his gavel falling like thunder. "Ms. Henderson, get out of my courtroom. And if I ever see evidence of you harassing anyone again, anywhere, I will personally ensure you face the full consequences of federal prosecution." As Margaret stumbled from the courtroom in ruins, Judge Williams was already reaching for his phone. He had a son to call, an apology to offer, and a family dinner to plan. Justice, finally, had been served. The sun was setting over Willowbrook Estates when Judge Robert Williams pulled into the driveway at 1247 Maple Drive. Marcus's red Chevrolet Silverado sat proudly in its rightful place, the chrome gleaming like a badge of honor in the golden light. The truck that had been stolen at dawn was home, but more than two. It was vindicated. Marcus opened the front door before his father could knock, his face a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and something deeper, a restoration of faith that had been nearly shattered by months of systematic cruelty. "Dad," he said simply, and the two men embraced on the front porch where Margaret Henderson had once stood with her clipboard and her hatred. "I'm sorry," Judge Williams whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this." Marcus pulled back, meeting his father's steel-gray eyes with his own. "You did protect me. You taught me to endure. You taught me that justice exists, even when it seems like the world is rigged against us. You taught me to be better than my enemies." Across the yard, Mrs. Chen emerged from her house, her walker clicking against the sidewalk. At 82, she moved slowly but with purpose, carrying a casserole dish that smelled like home and hope. "Judge Williams," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived war and discrimination and 8 decades of refusing to be broken. "I brought enough Korean barbecue for 3. We have celebrating to do." As they sat around Marcus's dining room table, Mrs. Chen regaled Judge Williams with stories of his son's kindness, how he'd fixed her fence during a storm, how he'd driven her to medical appointments when her son was deployed overseas, how he'd been the best neighbor she'd had in 15 years of living in Willowbrook Estates. "Your boy," she said, pointing her chopsticks at Marcus with obvious pride. "He's what America is supposed to be about. Hard work, helping others, treating people with dignity. That Henderson woman? She's what's wrong with this country." Judge Williams learned that the story was already spreading through the community like wildfire. Margaret Henderson's reign of terror was over, but more importantly, her victims were finding their voices. The elderly veteran she'd harassed after his surgery. The young Latina teacher she'd targeted for having too many visitors when her family came for Sunday dinner. The Iranian doctor she'd reported to immigration, despite his being a naturalized citizen for 20 years. One by one, they were coming forward. One by one, they were reclaiming their dignity. But the real victory wasn't in Margaret's destruction. It was in the community that was emerging from her ashes. The neighbors who'd been too afraid to speak out were now organizing. They were creating a new HOA board based on inclusion rather than exclusion, on community building rather than community policing. Marcus's phone buzzed with text messages throughout the evening, apologies from neighbors who'd remained silent, offers of friendship from people who'd wanted to reach out but feared Margaret's retaliation, invitations to barbecues, block parties, and community events. "You know what the best part is?" Marcus said, as his father prepared to leave that night. "I don't have to move. I don't have to run away. I get to stay in the home I chose, in the community I wanted to be part of." Judge Williams paused at the front door, looking back at the house his son had purchased with dreams of building a life. Margaret Henderson thought she could drive you away by making you feel like you didn't belong. But this was never about belonging, Marcus. This was about her trying to steal something that was already yours. As Judge Williams drove home through the quiet streets of Willowbrook Estates, he passed Margaret Henderson's townhouse. A for sale sign already stood in the front yard. Word traveled fast in suburban communities, and Margaret's neighbors had made it clear that her presence was no longer welcome. The irony was perfect. In trying to drive Marcus away, Margaret had driven herself into exile. 3 months later, Marcus Williams married his longtime girlfriend Sarah in the backyard of 1247 Maple Drive. Mrs. Chen officiated the ceremony, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Judge Williams gave a toast that brought tears to every eye present. "To my son and daughter," he said, raising his glass to the couple surrounded by their new community of genuine neighbors and friends, "may you build the America that Margaret Henderson tried to steal." The red Chevrolet Silverado sat in the driveway throughout the reception, no longer a symbol of Margaret's hatred, but a monument to the simple truth that justice sometimes arrives exactly when it's needed most. In the end, Margaret Henderson had been right about one thing. Marcus Williams really didn't belong in her version of Willowbrook Estates. He belonged in something infinitely better.